All right, black folks are not shocked by this story here. It seems that racial bias is affecting the plea bargaining process in criminal cases. Black people are paying the price. Shocker. It means a guilty plea and a criminal record and giving up your right to a trial. The study by Carlos Berdejó out of Loyola Law School shows that not only do black people face more severe punishments than whites for misdemeanors, but whites in such cases are 74% more likely to have all charges that could involve prison dropped, dismissed, or reduced. Now, if both whites and blacks had no criminal history, whites are still much more likely to have charges reduced. The study tracked nearly 31,000 misdemeanor cases in Wisconsin over 70 years, from charging to sentencing. It concluded that prosecutors use race to decide whether a person will repeat an offense when deciding what plea to offer. Most criminal punishments don't come out of jury trials, but in convictions imposed through plea deals. Now, of course, let's go to our panel. So you go to the Supreme Court, it says equal justice under law. That's been a lie before that thing was etched in that's granite.
And justice isn't blind either. As a former prosecutor from New York, Manhattan DA's office, I saw this firsthand. And you know, this implicit bias, how people who don't look like us, how they view us. And the study isn't really surprising, but to see it implemented in the criminal justice system is really disheartening. When I was a prosecutor, if you sold drugs, then you most likely weren't going to get a plea deal. But if you used drugs with me, you got a treatment program. To my white colleagues, though, that was just the opposite. There was no difference. With the police, when you wrote up a complaint, they would come in and white prosecutors would say, okay, tell me about who we arrested, were they black or brown? White people and the concept of white people committing crime just simply was not there. And that implicit bias is why we need more people of color in decision-making positions in prosecutors' offices around this country who set policy, but also determine and define who gets a plea deal and who doesn't.
You know, Roland, it's the tip of the iceberg there when you look at these plea deals, because you're also looking at a number of other things. A lot of people stay in jail because they don't have the money to get bailed out.
Right.
I've got a colleague who stayed in jail for 7 months because his parents could not bail him out. He's a younger brother. Anyway, he ended up taking a guilty plea in order for time served. Mm-hmm. He was accused of rape, but he ended up taking a guilty plea for sexual misconduct. Mm-hmm. The girlfriend withdrew the rape charge. She said he didn't do it, but they kept it anyway. And now this young brother has gotten a doctorate and cannot teach anywhere because he's a registered sex offender. Had his parents had the dollars, and he was told this by a white attorney after the fact, had his parents had the dollars to bail him out, he would never have had to plead guilty. So a lot of times, you know, when you see overcrowding in jails, a part of that overcrowding is a function of the racial biases that so many people bring. There's so many discretionary decisions.
Right. But getting out helps you, though, because Don, they don't see you as in jail. When you come to the arraignment and you come to the hearing, you're in an orange jumpsuit or something. I got to tell you, there's a powerful perception that you're not going to get as opposed to a suit and tie.
Before I go to Sharon, and of course, during the VP debate last year, Mike Pence as well as Tim Kaine, the idea of implicit bias came up. Shall I go to my iPad? Here's Mike Pence last year. See for yourself.
They also hear the bad-mouthing. The bad-mouthing that comes from people that seize upon tragedy in the wake of police action shootings as a reason to use a broad brush to accuse law enforcement of implicit bias or institutional racism. And that really has got to stop. I mean, when an African-American police officer in Charlotte named Brentley Vinson, an all-star football player who went to Liberty University here in the state, came home, followed his dad into law enforcement, joined the force in Charlotte in 2014, was involved in a police action shooting that claimed the life of Keith Lamont Scott. It was a tragedy. I mean, we mourn with those who mourn. We grieve with those who grieve. We're saddened at the loss of life. But Hillary Clinton actually referred to that moment as an example of implicit bias in the police force, where she used, when she was asked in the debate a week ago whether there was an implicit bias in law enforcement, her only answer was that there's implicit bias everyone in the United States. I just think what we ought to do is we ought to stop seizing on these moments of tragedy. We ought to assure the public that we'll have a full and complete and transparent investigation whenever there's a loss of life because of police action. But Senator, please, enough of this seeking every opportunity to demean law enforcement broadly by making the accusation of implicit bias every time tragedy occurs.
Elaine, people shouldn't be afraid to bring up issues of bias in law enforcement. And if you're afraid to have
I'm not afraid to bring that up.
If you're afraid to have the discussion, you'll never solve it. And so here's an example, heartbreaking. We would agree this is a heartbreaking example. The guy, Philando Castile, who was killed in St. Paul, he was a worker, a valued worker in a local school. And he was killed for no apparent reason in an incident that will be discussed and will be investigated. But when folks went and explored this situation, what they found is that Philando Castile, who was they called him Mr. Rogers with dreadlocks in the school that he worked. The kids loved him. That he had been stopped by police 40 or 50 times before that fatal incident. And if you look at sentencing in this country, African Americans and Latinos get sentenced for the same crimes at very different rates.
We need criminal justice reform. Indiana has passed criminal justice
But I just want to say, those who say we should not be able to bring up and talk about bias in the system will never solve the problem.
When an African American police officer is involved in a police action shooting involving an African American, why would Hillary Clinton accuse that African American police officer of implicit bias?
I guess I can't believe you are defending the position that there is no bias and it's a topic we don't
Governor
need
Pence,
to
I have a question on that point.
I did not make that statement.
Your fellow Republican.
Shannon, so this is what is interesting about that. So here you have Mike Pence, and Tim Kaine was right. Dude, you're acting like implicit bias doesn't even exist. So what happened? Trump wins. Jeff Sessions, we're going to pull back on these consent decrees because, it's hurting you guys' morale because y'all just not feeling so good about yourself. How about the person who's actually not guilty, but who has to accept the plea deal, to your point, because they can't afford it, and now they have it on their record? They probably don't feel as great.
Probably not. I mean, the criminal justice reform is so necessary. You talked about the consent decrees and pulling back on the consent decrees. I live in Baltimore. There is a consent decree on the table there that is absolutely needed. But, when you look at the traditional Republican, they don't want that. They're pulling back on that.
Yeah, the one that was the first one, Jeff Sessions literally, first of all, had never read it, totally denied everything that was in it. Okay, they didn't want to even enforce the one in Chicago that clearly stated officers, yeah, we call people niggas. They admitted it. And they're like, don't worry about it, y'all. That's gonna hurt y'all feelings.
Listen, I'd rather somebody hurt somebody's feelings than shoot somebody. So, in my opinion, we clearly need criminal justice reform. We need to look at these consent decrees. They were passed, they were created for a reason. There are issues, and anybody that is trying to act like there aren't issues, this is not political, this is just reality.
Well, thank goodness the judges in Baltimore, and I also believe in Chicago, rejected the government's motions. But let me tell you this, the most powerful person on earth on the street is the police, okay? Because once they make a decision to arrest you or you get convicted, it's not about having a record and going through the jail process. It's about not being able to get a job.
Yep.
It's not going to college, graduate.
Can't get student financial aid.
Credit.
It impacts your entire life.
Exactly. Let me tell you something. And they are the least educated in most jurisdictions of anyone in the criminal justice system.
And there's so much that's discretionary. I mean, that's the issue, is the discretion.
Yep.
If you look at the continuum between a decision to arrest, a decision to reduce the charges or drop the charges, a decision about who gets a plea deal, that's discretion, and that discretion is in the hands of mostly white people who mostly do not like black people.
And that's why I keep trying to tell those folks, if you don't vote for the district attorney, you are part of the problem, because when you change DAs, you change department policy when it comes to prosecutors.
Weekdays on TV One.
I will never lie to you.
Oh my God.
Roland Martin.
He doesn't want to talk to us. He wants to ignore us.
Uncensored.
Hell no. That ain't gonna cut it, boo.
Unapologetic.
No, that is fundamentally false. You are wrong.
Unfiltered.
He wants an America where we all look alike. He ain't talking about black people.
Unrelenting.
You better go work out, because you got a fight on your hands.
NewsOne Now with Roland Martin. Weekdays at 7 a.m. on TV One.